ballot within the ISO Environmental Management Committee to convert the ISO Net Zero guidelines into a full ISO. The ISO Net Zero standard has passed. And so that process has now officially begun, that the guidelines are being converted into the ISO Net Zero standard. Ideally, this standard will be done and dusted and launched at COP30. That is at the end of 2025, the big UN climate change negotiations happening in Brazil, which is really being seen as a decisive, crucial COP to bring together countries and make some really binding commitments and take serious action, making progress towards net zero.
You are listening to The Standard Show, the podcast that brings you the stories behind the standards, with Matthew Childs and Cindy Parakill.
By creating a net zero standard that has built into it a process for demonstrating progress towards net zero, the material difference for organizations is that they will actually be compelled and incentivized for the first time to demonstrate that progress. Right now, there is no mechanism in the voluntary initiatives, nonprofit world, or in the regulatory binding regulation space that compels organizations to demonstrate progress towards net zero. And there is no penalty for not doing so. There can be a penalty for not setting a net zero target or not disclosing your emissions, but crucially, not towards actually reducing emissions, which is the thing that needs to happen in order for us to avert the climate crisis and achieve net zero. So that is the absolutely mission critical change that will happen once the ISO net zero standard exists, that organizations, again, of all shapes and sizes around the world will have not only a roadmap for pursuing net zero, but also will be held accountable to demonstrating progress towards their net zero goals.
Hello, my name is Matthew Childs and I am with
Cindy Parakill.
Hey Cindy Parakill, how are you?
Well, I'm feeling as right as rain.
Ooh, nice. Any particular reason for that?
Maybe a good night's sleep and lots of sunshine. How about you?
Well, trying to take the heat out of things.
Very good.
Now, the voice you heard at the top of the episode was that of Shana Gallagher, Net Zero Engagement Manager at BSI. And to continue with our weather-based idioms theme this time, Shana was casting a light.
Very good.
Thank you. On the conversion of the current ISO Net Zero guidelines to the new international standard for net zero, and the material difference it will make by organisations using it. The standard is so new, in fact, that we don't even have a confirmed number for it yet.
Now, we have looked at the net zero guidelines before here on The Standard Show, back in episode 91, in fact, which we published in January 2023. So the net zero guidelines is not a standard, but an international workshop agreement, a different ISO deliverable produced through workshop meetings rather than through the full ISO technical committee process. The new standard, number to be announced, will be developed over the next 18 months with a view to it being launched, as Shana said, at COP30 in November 2025, taking place in the Amazon in Brazil. And its development will involve collaboration between thousands of experts through national standards bodies across more than 170 countries.
BSI, in its role as the UK National Standards Body, in collaboration with Icontech, Colombia's National Standards Body, is convening this development process, which will include a public consultation expected in 2025 to ensure that all voices are heard. The development process for the new standard was launched at the London Climate Action Week 2024, which took place at the end of June, alongside the first meeting of the International Working Group developing the standard. So this episode is my conversation with Shana about the ongoing story of the relationship between standards and net zero, the net zero guidelines, and the new standard. Before we hear it, a reminder that you can rate, review and subscribe to The Standard Show wherever you get your podcasts. And you can get in touch and find and follow us on social media too. All the details are in the show notes. So, Shana Gallagher is Net Zero Engagement Manager at BSI, and she works with organisations and businesses who are using the ISO Net Zero guidelines to develop credible net zero strategies.
Competing approaches and concepts for net zero cause confusion. So, launched at COP27, the net zero guidelines provide a common reference for collective efforts on net zero. They offer a global basis for harmonizing, understanding, and planning for net zero at all levels by organizations, cities, and countries.
I spoke to Shana about the development of the guidelines and the difference they have made and are making to organisations and businesses facing the challenges posed by the net zero transition, and also about the conversion, this journey from guidelines to new international standard, and what she describes as the Zen calm that she hopes will come from it. Stick around to the end of the interview too, because being the Standards Show, I also asked Shana about her own standards journey, which she describes as a little unorthodox. Now, with terms like climate crisis and net zero becoming common phrases, it's often easy to forget what is actually meant by them. So I started by asking Shana to start at the beginning. What is net zero and why does it matter?
Net zero matters because if we don't achieve it, this state that I will describe, by 2050, then we will not be able to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, which means we will have worsening catastrophic climate change. And we are already seeing that the climate is changing in very dangerous ways that are affecting health and communities and feedstocks and weather and infrastructure, and will only continue to do so in increasingly catastrophic and dramatic ways. So that is why it matters. Now, the definition prior to publication of the ISO net zero guidelines was not clear and still is very unclear of what actually is net zero for a lot of people. So it's a very fair question. And that is why the ISO net zero guidelines were such an important milestone in the net zero transition, because prior to them being published, there was really no codified definition within the ISO system, or frankly, anywhere else, for what net zero actually means. And so the definition in the guidelines is the condition in which human-caused residual greenhouse gas emissions are balanced by human-led removals over a specified period and within specified boundaries. What that means is based on science that has been accumulated by the UN through a body called the IPCC. That's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the scientists who are the default voice of truth when it comes to, again, limiting warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, avoiding catastrophic climate change, say that in order to achieve this state of net zero by 2050 successfully, we will have, as a global society, have reduced emissions and eliminated them by 90%. So this residual emissions mentioned in the definition in the ISO net zero guidelines is about that remaining 10% that we haven't completely reduced or eliminated. But for our listeners, they should understand that achieving net zero by 2050, and net zero inherently as a definition these days includes this 2050 deadline, means that we have reduced, mitigated, eliminated emissions by at least 90%. And then that the remaining 10% of emissions that we are still producing as a global society that cannot be mitigated or eliminated through technology, a switch to renewable energy, for example, are then balanced by removals. So that's investing in carbon sinks, for example, planting trees. That is the most well-known example. But for all intents and purposes, very simply, net zero means we have, by 2050 or sooner, reduced or eliminated emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, human-caused, by 90%.
Now, you mentioned the net zero guidelines, which I'm going to come back to, and also standards as well. But before we get to that, obviously it matters. It's a very big deal, and we are in a transition towards it. So what are the biggest barriers to this net zero transition?
It's a really important question that the guidelines help answer, actually, because you'll often hear advocates of urgent climate action, which of course I am one of these advocates, say, well, we have the technology to get to net zero. And that is true. We do have the technology to get to net zero. It's clearly not that easy, or else we would be there already, and we are certainly far from it. So I would say the biggest challenge to achieving net zero is political will. And I would say the second biggest challenge is technical capacity, because though we do have technically the technology available to allow us to transition to net zero, we do not have that technology in position and at scale sufficiently. So the best example of this is grid decarbonization. We do not have national grids all around the world that are relying on renewable energy. And that transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy powering our national grids in every country on earth is going to take a very long time. And in fact, won't happen without the political will that I already mentioned, providing a regulatory regime that allows that transition to happen in an efficient way that is not crashing national economies. So political will and technical capacity are the two biggest challenges to the net zero transition.
So two pretty big and important barriers there and challenges. I just wonder generally, before we get to the net zero guidelines, how can standards generally help organisations to overcome these barriers, or policymakers too?
So for organizations, first of all, the net zero transition is complex. It is not simple, and it does take time and resources. And standards like the ISO Net Zero Guidelines, which is a pre-standard, can help to inform the journey and process that organizations go through when considering net zero and making a plan to achieve it. That is exactly what the ISO Net Zero Guidelines were designed to do. But there are standards that apply to many of the nuanced, diverse aspects of the transition that can be used to essentially provide a roadmap for organizations to actually credibly pursue net zero and, importantly, be able to demonstrate progress towards net zero. And for policymakers, really helpful tool as well. Standards are consensus-based, expert designed, stable, and best practice representations of industry needs. They take quite a long time to develop, but they often don't take as long as regulation. And so there's a strong precedent for policymakers to point to standards as examples of best practice. And net zero definitely is another issue that this can and should increasingly apply to, where if you're referring to standards as opposed to writing legislation from scratch, it allows policymakers to reference standards and then not have to write the legislation on their own and be able to update legislation as standards are updated to reflect industry needs.
I'm glad you've mentioned regulation there, because I do want to come back to that. But let's get to the heart of this then. What are the net zero guidelines? What do they say and why were they developed?
What they include are the 7 steps of net zero action. They provide a comprehensive set of principles for organizations in designing a credible, holistic net zero strategy. And I'll come back to what those 7 steps are. But the reason that they were designed is because prior to BSI convening a collaboration that developed and then launched the ISO Net Zero Guidelines at COP27, that was at the end of 2022, the UN climate change negotiations, there was no deliverable or framework within the ISO system that defined net zero or the principles of a path to achieve it. And that was a big problem, because if you agree that standards are the fabric of the real economy, which they are, there are tens of thousands of standards, if not more, at use in every sector, every economy, every industry to varying extents around the world, and you also agree that the real economy needs to transition to net zero, then you would probably agree that transitions need to be aligned, that standards need to be aligned with the transition, and also that we should have a standard that is in fact facilitating that transition. And that is what the ISO Net Zero guidelines do. They fill this very important gaping void in the standards portfolio around how do we demonstrate a credible net zero transition plan. Because this was an urgent gap to fill, the guidelines were designed in record time, 6 months, and that is why they are not yet a fully certifiable standard, a full ISO, but they are being converted into that as we speak. And so when that conversion process is complete and the ISO Net Zero standard exists, there will be a very crucial accountability and verification mechanism that enters the net zero governance transition. And that is going to help compel credible progress towards net zero in a really important way that is lacking right now and is in fact necessary to help us achieve net zero by 2050. And we already talked about the consequences of not doing that. So just again, back to what's actually included in the guidelines, these 7 steps of net zero action that I mentioned. The first is to prepare. The second is to measure. So know your emissions. You can't reduce what you haven't measured. The third is to set a target, the net zero target. Most importantly, the fourth is to reduce. So what is your actual plan to mitigate emissions? And then the final steps are about removals, reporting, and impact. And the impact section is very comprehensive and in its own right talks about alignment of external affairs and advocacy, leadership and governance, ramifications, a just transition. So again, there's a lot in there. I would encourage listeners to take a look at iso.org/net-zero, but it is a uniquely comprehensive and holistic document for setting a net zero target and developing a credible path to achieve it. We are extremely proud of how successful the guidelines have been since they were launched. They have been downloaded well over 40,000 times, which is the second most downloaded standard in the ISO portfolio, I believe. And because they were developed by experts from over 100 countries, over 1,200 stakeholders through the ISO consensus-based process, we know that dissemination has happened at a global scale. And there has been a ton of news coverage of the guidelines when they were first launched. There will be more news coverage coming up this next week, in fact, based on a report that I'll speak about in a second. But we know that they have been picked up and referenced and used by organizations and companies around the world. Because they're not yet a certifiable standard, we are not able to see exactly how many companies are using them right now and being audited against them. But we certainly know that there have been hundreds of companies that have taken notice, and that the real impact of helping to demonstrate a threshold and a standard for what is a credible net zero strategy, and to have that be the bar for what does good net zero action look like, has been profound and meaningful and will only continue to be so as the standard is developed. And so the media coverage I was just speaking to is that an example of a company that's already using the ISO Net Zero guidelines to develop their transition plan is General Motors. This is one of the companies that I work with most closely, and they chose to adopt the guidelines mid-year last year, 2023. And so I work with them to help ensure that their net zero strategy is aligned to all the principles, the many principles within the ISO Net Zero guidelines. And so some key changes that they've been able to make to their net zero strategy based on that adoption include actually shifting from carbon neutrality to pursuing net zero, which is a really big change, setting interim targets, which helps provide a roadmap for net zero and really compel action now as opposed to kicking the can down the road. And those interim targets are to be announced soon. Another really good example is they now tie executive remuneration to their progress on Scope 3 decarbonization, and Scope 3 emissions are 99% of their emissions. So that is a very meaningful change that they've implemented thanks to adoption of the guidelines. And there are dozens more that I could cite. But once again, that report is being published by BSI in about 2 weeks. So stay tuned. But all this to say, companies are already using the guidelines to enhance and develop their net zero strategies to be in line with global consensus-based best practice. That is going to increase significantly when the guidelines are converted into a certifiable net zero standard. And we know that there's already a lot of attention on the ISO system and on the guidelines, thanks to the unique role that they have provided within the ISO global system of defining for the first time what is net zero and what are the principles of a credible path to achieving it.
So General Motors then, Shana, they've adopted the net zero guidelines. How did they approach that?
So to their credit, General Motors had quite an ambitious net zero strategy and a very big, well-resourced net zero team, even prior to adopting the guidelines. And something that is in the guidelines that they were already aligned with when they chose to adopt them is about leadership and governance and ensuring that there is a C-suite level, at least one competent professional who is responsible for the net zero planning within an organization. And in fact, ideally, there will be multiple C-suite and board level folks who are responsible for net zero at the very highest level. That is quite necessary based on all of the data and investigation of net zero planning in terms of delivering on net zero goals. So Kristen Seaman, who is the CSO for General Motors, she was already in place before adoption, but has been quite a champion for adoption of the guidelines and has really helped to bring forward to the board and the rest of C-suite the changes that will need to be made within the entire business based on adoption of the guidelines. So that is mechanically how the adoption process has been working for them. In terms of their alignment, I've been working with them on a process that I go through with all of our what are called case study organizations that are using the ISO net zero guidelines. And this is something that any organization anywhere in the world can do, which is called a gap analysis. We take the principles of the ISO net zero guidelines, map them out against the existing net zero strategy of the organization. And based on where gaps exist, we create a project plan to fill them. So an example of another company that we work with that listeners will likely have heard of is the, excuse my accent, Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile, the international governing body of motorsports, parent governance organization for F1, for example, many other championships and racing circuits and membership organizations around the world. And when they chose to adopt the ISO net zero guidelines, they, like many organizations, had a net zero target, but essentially no plan to get there. And so my work with them has been much more ground level, building up what is our net zero transition plan going to be based on these principles. Their gap analysis was essentially a complete gap. And so the guidelines provide that roadmap as well for any organization at any stage of their net zero journey to chart that credible path to net zero and be able to start demonstrating progress towards it.
Standards affect all of us every day, wherever we go, whatever we do. By defining good practice, they help people and organizations to do things better. Each year, standards bodies publish thousands of standards, and we are looking for more people like you to join our community of standards makers. We welcome applicants from all fields, backgrounds, and career stages. Our goal is a simple one: to have a balance of views around the table. By becoming a standards maker, you could help to improve the way things are made and done, like creating healthier and more inclusive workplaces, developing higher quality healthcare systems, making advances in AI governance, or accelerating climate action, and many, many others. So, if you want to make a difference and shape the world through standards, start your standards making journey now. Details of how to do so are in the show notes.
As the use of the net zero guidelines are voluntary, how are they working with and supporting regulation?
So all standards are voluntary technically, but what compels organizations to use them more than voluntary initiatives or frameworks that within the net zero transition have historically mobilized a lot of private sector action are three things. First of all, ISO standards, of course, are part of this global system of 171 different national standards bodies. That means that the transition can happen at a much more global level, which is imperative because the climate crisis is a global crisis and must happen globally in order to succeed. The second one is most relevant to your question. It is about this legacy relationship between national standards bodies and policymakers. So the model is different in every country. The British Standards Institution, for example, is not a part of the UK government, but we do have a royal charter. We do have strong, long-standing relationships with government across many different levels, agencies, and departments. And then many national standards bodies around the world are actually a part of their national governments. So the relationship there is baked in. And at the international level, very importantly, ISO and the World Trade Organization have a special relationship whereby the World Trade Organization has, under its technical barriers to trade, to prevent, barriers to trade, it's under the TBT agreement, that policymakers in WTO member countries, which is most countries, must cite certifiable standards when they are creating policy relevant to those standards if the standard exists. So, from an interoperability standpoint, it is imperative that we get this net zero standard right because today there is not a lot of binding regulation around the world that exists that says organizations need to get to net zero. In fact, there's no country on earth that mandates that organizations within it must achieve or pursue net zero. There is increasingly disclosure regulation that says companies or organizations need to be reporting on their emissions and maybe their net zero target. But the missing piece in the transition that the ISO net zero standard will help provide is this demonstrable progress towards net zero. And increasingly, we can expect policy to reflect the need to demonstrate this progress. And so, if and when we get this ISO net zero standard right, and that can help inform emerging policy regulation in every WTO member country as a result, it will really help to ensure that the net zero transition is happening as efficiently and effectively as possible at a global level. And the third thing is that the degree to which the real economy is underpinned by standards cannot be understated. The reason this matters and why leveraging the formal international standard system matters so much when it comes to net zero is because this system already works and is already in place. And we don't think about it because it's out of sight, out of mind, and because it works. The reason we trust the food that we eat isn't going to poison us, we know the laptop we buy is going to work, is because of standards. And so this is about leveraging an existing system to dramatically scale and accelerate net zero action. And arguably, there's nothing else that we could do to as rapidly and urgently pursue net zero as leveraging such a powerful behind the scenes but crucial system that powers the real economy in order to reduce emissions and achieve this net zero goal, prevent catastrophic climate change, then develop this standard and make sure that as many organizations around the world as possible are certifying against it. So think about the real economy as it works today. What we're proposing is not revolutionary. It's about making sure that the real economy is aligned with the transition, given that there is now soon to be a standard that is supporting and facilitating that transition. And that is going to make the biggest difference in actually compelling net zero action, arguably more powerfully than anything possibly could other than mandatory regulation.
Now, Shane, you've trailed this a few times within this conversation so far. So I kind of know the answer to this, but I want you to really want to explore it for me. What's next for the net zero guidelines?
Yes. So as of 2 weeks ago, very excited to announce some breaking news on the podcast today, which will also be formally announced during London Climate Action Week on June 27th, which is that the ballot within the ISO Environmental Management Committee to convert the ISO Net Zero guidelines into a full ISO, the ISO Net Zero standard, has passed. And so that process has now officially begun, that the guidelines are being converted into the ISO Net Zero standard. Ideally, this standard will be done and dusted and launched at COP30. That is at the end of 2025, the big UN climate change negotiations happening in Brazil, which is really being seen as a decisive, crucial COP to bring together countries and make some really binding commitments and take serious action making progress towards net zero. So that is the very exciting update and timeline for this conversion process. But I'll once again say, in the interim, the guidelines do exist. They can be used by companies and organizations of any size, sector, jurisdiction already. And so the other thing in terms of what's next for the guidelines is that more and more companies will be using them to develop their net zero strategies as a means of de-risking themselves against not only the impending ISO net zero standard, but also all of the alphabet soup of ESG frameworks and initiatives that are cited and converged within the ISO net zero guidelines, such as SBTI, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, TCFD, and many other acronyms that I could list.
We do love our acronyms in the
We
standard
really
world.
do.
I just wonder, Shana, about timing here. Why develop the international standard now? And also just thinking, we talked about impact earlier on and making a difference. What additional difference will having an international standard on net zero, how will it additionally help to address the barriers you talked about earlier to the net zero transition?
Yeah, so I talked about those barriers, political will and technical capacity, but connected to those two barriers is what I would argue the third barrier of a lack of trust and accountability in the net zero transition. This has led to various phenomena that I will now describe. Greenwashing, which many listeners will be familiar with, this concept of making green claims that are not actually substantiated or corroborated by any real action. There's also, because of fears of greenwashing accusations, increasingly been a phenomenon of green hushing or green stalling, in which organizations are either taking net zero action very quietly behind the scenes or stalling their action because they're so scared of being accused of greenwashing that they just say, well, it's better for us not to do anything because there's no clear standard. Because there's no clear standard for what does good look like when it comes to net zero, it's much easier to criticize and scrutinize than to be able to proudly say, look at all the great work that we're doing. And there is today no certifiable net zero standard that exists in the market. So developing this standard now, it is late. I wish it had happened earlier because, again, the climate crisis is upon us, but it is certainly not too late, and we still urgently need this clarity in the market for understanding, both as consumers, as investors, as governments, who is doing a good job on net zero and who isn't. And having that certifiable net zero standard is going to provide the trust and accountability that is crucially lacking from the net zero transition right now.
Now, Shane, you explained earlier on that the net zero guidelines that we currently have been downloaded 40,000 plus times, and organisations are out there digesting them and using them. And you gave a couple of examples of organisations that have adopted them and are using them. We're now going to have international standard. Well, the process has started. I just wonder what material difference it will make then for an organisation who has adopted the standards but now thinking, okay, we're on the journey to certification. What material difference will it make to the organisation and maybe sort of the wider stakeholders and their clients and customers out there?
I'm going to answer that question by sharing some history about the net zero transition, which is that I've implied historically the transition has been governed by organizations, voluntary nonprofit organizations that have sprung up in the absence, arguably, of a net zero standard and the formal international standards system coming to play, have sprung up to mobilize the private sector to take net zero action. So the most well-known example of that is the Science Based Target Initiative. And they created a target setting platform whereby companies could set net zero targets. And so the transition to date in terms of organizations that have done anything about net zero has primarily looked like setting a target and maybe starting to report on and disclose emissions. But that's been it. That is the extent of net zero action that most organizations have taken. And of course, the overwhelming majority of organizations around the world have done nothing about net zero. Not because they don't want to necessarily, but because they don't have the resources or capacity, and because it's so unclear what does net zero mean and how do we get there to most organizations right now. So by creating a net zero standard that has built into it a process for demonstrating progress towards net zero, the material difference for organizations is that they will actually be compelled and incentivized for the first time to demonstrate that progress. Right now, there is no mechanism in the voluntary initiatives, nonprofit world, or in the regulatory binding regulation space that compels organizations to demonstrate progress towards net zero. And there is no penalty for not doing so. There can be a penalty for not setting a net zero target or not disclosing your emissions, but crucially, not towards actually reducing emissions, which is the thing that needs to happen in order for us to avert the climate crisis and achieve net zero. So that is the absolutely mission critical change that will happen once the ISO net zero standard exists, that organizations, again, of all shapes and sizes around the world will have not only a roadmap for pursuing net zero, but also will be held accountable to demonstrating progress towards their net zero goals.
What are you most excited about with this new standard?
The thing I'm most excited about is actually just Zen, the Zen calm that we will all feel when we understand what is net zero and who's doing a good job and who isn't. Right now, if you talk to people who work in the net zero landscape at all, or any sustainability professional, they will probably be frantic and depressed and confused because of what I already mentioned earlier, the alphabet soup of ESG and net zero governance. It is confusing, it's fragmented, and it's part of the reason that we're not making progress as urgently as we need to, because it's unclear what to do and it's unclear who's doing a good job and who isn't. So that clarity that the international standard system provides by converging and harmonizing best practice in one place, and then also providing auditable, certifiable progress towards net zero, is just a decrease in blood pressure that we all really need and deserve in this world today. And I'm very excited about that.
Now, Shana had been speaking there about the journey of a standard, or maybe more accurately, the journey to the start of a new standard for net zero. But I wanted to finish our conversation with something a bit more personal about her own standards journey. As regular listeners to the podcast will know, standards journeys are something we like to do. So I asked her, what's been her standards journey? How and when did it start? And where is she now?
I guess no one has an orthodox standards journey, but mine is quite unorthodox. I have spent my career really tried to answering the question, how can I have the greatest impact in averting the climate crisis? Because I fundamentally believe that it is the most existential threat that humanity has ever faced. And I am extremely passionate about preserving the only world we have. Kind of a no-brainer. And I, for this reason, worked in politics in the US for about 8 years prior to moving back to the UK, which we could have a whole other podcast discussing. And there are many podcasts discussing US politics. I would recommend your podcast above all of those. But that time working in US politics was not sufficient in generating the political will that I wanted to take action on climate. I do take full credit for the Inflation Reduction Act, but other than that, I did not feel like my time in US politics was creating the impact that I wanted to in terms of urgent emissions reductions. And so I moved back to the UK where I've lived before, because this is a country that certainly has its flaws, but does not question whether the climate crisis is real, and does not have half of the population that is doubting climate science. And so I felt like I could do a lot more good work for the transition and for generating urgent action on climate change based here. And I was doing a master's in climate change finance and management at Imperial, and learned about standards and found this role at BSI while I was graduating. And the more I learned about the opportunity to, as I've described, leverage this extremely powerful but behind the scenes system to be aligned with the transition and facilitate the transition, the more I realized that actually this net zero engagement manager opportunity was my answer to that question. How can I have the greatest possible impact in tackling the climate crisis? And I fundamentally believe that the work that we're doing to create the world's first certifiable net zero standard is going to make that difference. So that is my standards journey. It was not planned. It was not premeditated, but I'm very happy about it and could not be prouder of my 1-year anniversary coming up in 2 weeks.
Our thanks to Shana for speaking to us about the journey from net zero guidelines to new net zero standard, and for sharing with us her own standards journey. Now, if you want to discover more about how standards are accelerating climate action, the net zero guidelines themselves, which are available to download for free, the launch of the new standard, and also about how to get involved in standards, then check out the links in the show notes. And a reminder that the show notes are also where you can find details of our socials and all the other ways to get in touch with us here on The Standard Show.
You have been listening to an episode of The Standard Show, the podcast that brings you the stories behind the standards, with Matthew Childs and Cindy Parakill.
You just heard a Stripped Media production.